What if the sun gets cold? No one noticed it at first, not in the way people notice disasters with sirens and headlines, but in the quiet way a room loses warmth when a door's left open somewhere far away. A subtle thinning of heat that slipped into mornings unnoticed, where the light still came but felt hollow, pale, like a memory of brightness rather than brightness itself. And across the world, people woke to a strange stillness in the air, birds slower to move, shadows sharper and longer, as if the light no longer wrapped around things but merely touched them. And scientists began speaking in hushed voices about solar output anomalies, about energy curves that dipped where they should have risen, about numbers that suggested not a fluctuation but a decline, a steady and impossible draining of the sun's power, as if something at its core had simply decided to stop. And days passed and the warmth continued to fade, so gradually that the human body adapted before the mind could panic, sweaters appearing earlier in the season, heaters turning on longer, oceans losing their gentle breath as surface temperatures dropped by degrees that felt small on paper but vast in consequence. And the sky, once a deep and endless blue, began to lose its saturation, becoming a thin, washed-out canvas stretched over a cooling world, while at night the stars burned brighter than ever before, piercing and cold, as if reclaiming territory long held back by the sun's dominance. And somewhere deep within observatories, screens filled with data that no one wanted to believe, models predicting a cascade of failure as the sun's fusion slowed, its core no longer sustaining the reactions that had burned for billions of years. And panic finally took shape not in noise, but in silence, in the way governments stopped making promises and started making preparations, in the way people looked at each other with a question they could not voice. And the first real sign came when snow fell in places that had never known winter, delicate at first, almost beautiful, dusting deserts and coastlines in a quiet transformation that felt unreal until it did not melt, until it stayed, layering and thickening, turning the familiar into something alien. And crops began to fail, not suddenly, but with a creeping inevitability, fields yielding less with each passing week, plants unable to draw the energy they needed from a sun that no longer gave enough, and cities dimmed, not from lack of electricity, but from a growing understanding that light itself was becoming scarce in a deeper sense, something primal slipping away. And then came the day when the sun rose and people felt nothing from it, no warmth on their skin, no subtle pressure of heat, just a pale disk hanging in the sky like a frozen eye, distant and indifferent. And that was the moment when fear became universal, when every person on Earth understood that something fundamental had broken, that the engine of life itself was failing. And the world responded in fragments, some turning inward, seeking shelter, digging into the ground, building insulated refuges beneath the surface where geothermal heat could still be harnessed. Others turning outward, launching desperate missions into space, probes sent toward the sun not to study, but to understand if anything could be done, if the great star could somehow be reignited. But as weeks turned into months, the cold deepened. Oceans began to crust at the edges, ice forming where waves once moved freely, creeping inward in a slow conquest, and winds grew sharper, cutting through cities with a dry, biting force that stripped warmth from everything it touched. And humanity began to change, adapting in ways both technological and emotional, communities forming around shared heat sources, underground networks spreading beneath the surface like roots, while above, the world became quieter, emptier, vast stretches of land abandoned to the encroaching cold. And the sun continued to dim, its light fading not into darkness, but into a dull gray glow that barely reached the planet. And astronomers watched in disbelief as its surface grew calmer, the violent flares and storms that once defined it settling into stillness,
as if the star itself were going to sleep. And in that stillness, there was something terrifyingly final, something that suggested not a cycle, but an end. And yet life persisted, stubborn and fragile, clinging to the last remnants of heat, finding ways to endure in a world that was becoming unrecognizable. And in the deepest underground cities, where artificial lights mimicked the lost sun and machines hummed with borrowed energy, people told stories of warmth, of summer, of days when the sky felt alive, passing down memories like precious artifacts. And above them, the frozen surface stretched endlessly beneath a dim, silent star, a world paused between what it had been and what it might become, waiting in the cold for something that might never return.
And yet the waiting itself began to shape a new kind of existence, one defined not by seasons, but by endurance, where time was measured in the slow migration of ice and the gradual dimming of a sky that no longer changed color. And beneath the surface, the underground cities grew into vast, interconnected labyrinths, humming with life sustained by ingenuity rather than sunlight. Geothermal veins tapped like hidden rivers of fire, reactors built to replace the lost warmth, and people learned to live without the rhythm of day and night, their bodies adjusting to artificial cycles that felt both precise and hollow. While above them, the continents transformed into silent white plains, broken only by the skeletal remains of cities encased in frost, skyscrapers standing like frozen monuments to a world that had once thrived in light. And the oceans, once restless and alive, thickened into vast, unmoving sheets that creaked and shifted with a slow, grinding sound, as if the planet itself were adjusting to a new, colder identity. And still the sun lingered in the sky, not gone, but diminished, a pale sphere that cast a weak, colorless glow across the Earth's surface, its presence more symbolic than sustaining, a reminder of what had been lost rather than a source of hope. And over time, even that glow began to fade further, shrinking in intensity until it resembled a distant star rather than the central force of a solar system. And it was then that a different kind of question began to take hold among those who studied the sky, not how to survive, but whether the sun's decline was truly an ending or merely a transformation into something not yet understood. And deep within research chambers carved into the bedrock, scientists pored over data that hinted at strange anomalies, faint pulses of energy emanating from the sun at irregular intervals, signals so weak they could have been dismissed as noise, yet persistent enough to suggest that something within the star still stirred, some remnant of its former self refusing to fully extinguish. And theories emerged, wild and uncertain, that the sun was not dying, but entering a state never before observed, a kind of cosmic dormancy, where its core reactions had slowed to a near halt, conserving what little energy remained, as if the star were retreating inward, gathering itself in silence. And this idea, fragile as it was, spread through the underground networks like a quiet spark, not enough to ignite hope, but enough to prevent complete despair. And so humanity endured, not just out of necessity, but out of a growing curiosity, a need to witness whatever would come next. And generations passed in the dim glow of artificial light, children born who had never felt the warmth of the sun, who knew it only as a story, a concept described in lessons and preserved in archives. And for them, the cold was not an invasion, but a constant, the natural state of the world. And yet even they would look upward through reinforced shafts that reached toward the surface, staring at the faint, distant sun with a sense of wonder, as if sensing that it still held a secret. And one day, long after the last memory of true sunlight had faded from living minds, the pulses from the sun grew stronger, not brighter in light, but deeper in presence, a subtle vibration that instruments could detect with increasing clarity. And across the underground cities, alerts were triggered, not of danger, but of change, and people gathered around screens and projections, watching as data streams shifted in ways no one had ever seen. And above, the frozen world remained still, the ice unmoving, the air silent, as if everything were holding its breath. And then, without warning, the sun flickered, not in brightness, but in color,
a faint hue appearing within its pale disk, a whisper of warmth not yet felt, but somehow visible. And for the first time in generations, the sky itself seemed to hesitate, as though the long, cold night of the world had reached a point where it might either deepen into eternity or begin, however slowly, to change into something new.
And that hesitation became a moment, stretched across the entire planet, a pause so profound it seemed to suspend even thought itself, as if the earth and everything upon it were listening for something beyond sound. And in the underground cities, the hum of machines felt suddenly louder, more fragile, as though the artificial world humanity had built was aware of its own impermanence. And above the ice, the faint color within the sun deepened by an immeasurable degree, not enough to warm the surface, not enough to melt even the thinnest frost, but enough to shift perception, to remind the watchers that change was not a myth, but a process unfolding too slowly for instinct to grasp. And instruments began to record a subtle rise in energy output, a tremor in the quiet heart of the star that suggested not a return to what it had been, but the beginning of something entirely different, a new state forming where the old one had collapsed. And the scientists who had spent their lives studying the dying sun now found themselves staring at data that refused to fit any known model, numbers that hinted at reactions occurring at levels too low for traditional fusion, yet too consistent to be random decay, as if the sun were learning how to burn again in a quieter, more restrained way, conserving rather than expending, enduring rather than dominating. And this idea spread through the networks, not as hope, but cautious awareness, a recognition that the universe was not bound to human expectations, that even stars could change their nature in ways no one had imagined. And over time, the faint color grew steadier, shifting from a ghostly gray to a dim, pale gold that painted the frozen world in a new kind of light, one that lacked warmth but carried a strange sense of presence, a reminder that the sun still existed, not as a memory, but as a living, evolving entity. And in the highest observation towers, built at the edges of the ice fields where the sky could be seen without obstruction, people gathered in silence, watching this transformation unfold across years that felt like moments, and moments that felt like years. And among them were those who had never known anything but cold, whose understanding of warmth was abstract and distant. And yet even they felt something shift within themselves, a quiet stirring that mirrored the subtle awakening in the sky. And beneath the surface, the underground cities began to change as well, not in structure, but in purpose, as efforts slowly turned from mere survival to cautious preparation, systems designed not only to preserve heat, but to distribute it should the environment above ever allow it. Greenhouses expanded, seeds long stored in cryogenic vaults brought into experimental growth chambers, and the idea of a future on the surface, once abandoned, began to re-enter conversation, not as certainty, but as possibility. And still, the sun continued its slow transformation, its light strengthening by degrees so small they could only be measured over decades, its color deepening into a steady, muted glow that cast faint shadows across the ice. And then, one day, in a place where the frozen ocean stretched unbroken to the horizon, a crack appeared, a thin, almost invisible fracture in the endless sheet, not caused by force or movement, but by a subtle shift in temperature, a difference so slight it would have been meaningless in the old world, yet here it was enough to change the surface. And that crack became a symbol, captured and transmitted across every network, a simple line in the ice that carried a weight far beyond its size, because it proved that the cold was not absolute, that the stillness could be altered, that the long silence of the world might one day give way to motion again. And as the crack widened by fractions over the passing years, the sun above continued to glow with its quiet, restrained light, no longer the blazing force it had once been, but something more enduring, more measured, a star that had learned to exist in a different way. And humanity, shaped by generations of darkness and adaptation, found itself standing at the threshold of a future that would not resemble the past, but would not be empty either. A future where warmth might return not as a flood, but as a gradual unfolding, where life would rise again not in abundance but in resilience. And in that slow, deliberate transformation, the world discovered a new kind of balance, one not built on the certainty of endless light, but on the understanding that even in the deepest cold, change was always possible, waiting patiently for the moment when it could begin. And so the beginning of that change did not arrive as a sudden thaw or a dramatic return of warmth, but as a quiet accumulation of small shifts that over time rewrote the meaning of the world itself. The crack in the ice widening into a network of fine fractures that spread across frozen seas like delicate veins, each one a sign that the rigid stillness was weakening, that beneath the surface something long suppressed was stirring again. And in the dim, patient light of the altered sun, those fractures began to deepen, edges softening, surfaces losing their perfect hardness as molecules that had been locked in place for generations found the slightest freedom to move. And where the cracks intersected, dark lines formed, not yet water, but no longer solid, a transitional state that existed only because the world itself was changing. And in observation towers, people watched this transformation with a focus that bordered on reverence, knowing they were witnessing something no human had ever seen, a planet relearning motion after an age of silence. And beneath them, in the vast underground cities, preparations intensified, not with urgency, but with precision. Systems recalibrated to respond to the faint increase in external temperature, sealed passages tested and reopened in stages, small exploratory teams sent to the surface, clad in suits designed not just to protect from cold, but to sense it, to measure every nuance of change in the air and ground. And those first steps onto the shifting ice carried a weight that no one spoke aloud, because each footprint marked not just movement, but a return, a reconnection with a world that had been lost to memory. And the explorers reported back not of warmth, but of difference, a subtle softness in the air, a faint variability where once there had been absolute uniformity, winds that no longer cut with the same merciless precision, but moved in gentle, uncertain currents as if unsure of their own existence. And over time, these reports accumulated into a pattern, a slow but undeniable trend toward change, and with it came a transformation in human perception, a shift from endurance to anticipation, from surviving the cold to studying its retreat, however gradual it might be. And generations that had known only the underground began to dream of the surface not as a myth, but as a future, a place they might one day inhabit rather than merely observe. And as the dim, enduring light continued to grow, so too did the understanding that the world would never return to what it had been, but would instead become something entirely new, a place where warmth existed not as a constant, but as a gift, something earned through time and preserved through care. And in that realization, as people stood on the slowly changing surface beneath a sky that was beginning to breathe again, there was no longer a question of whether the sun had gotten cold, but a deeper awareness that even in its coldest state, it had never truly stopped, it had only changed. And in changing, it had carried everything with it into a future that was as uncertain as it was quietly alive.